England, winter of 1944. The war has dragged through another bitter season of rain, mud, and loss. At a small airfield in East Anglia, the ground trembles as a battered P-47 Thunderbolt skids across the frozen earth and dies in a plume of smoke. When the dust settles, the great machine lies silent, its nose buried deep, the fuselage twisted, wings bent like broken arms. To most who see it, the verdict is simple. Scrap, another machine consumed by the endless appetite of war. But one man doesn't see the wreckage. Staff Sergeant Walter "Red" Harris, 24 years old, Oklahoma farm boy turned aircraft mechanic, stands beside the broken fighter and refuses to turn away. He runs a hand along the crumpled cowling, feels the cold metal under his palm and whispers, "She's not done yet." In a world built on orders, he disobeys them. In a war built on machines, he trusts his hands. While the rest of the base sleeps, Harris returns to the hangar. The rain drums on the roof. The smell of oil and mud fills the air. He lights a single work lamp and begins an act that no manual could explain. Rivets, scrap metal, wire, spent bullet casings hammered flat into shape. By morning, the impossible will begin to take form. They said a crashed P-47 couldn't be rebuilt. They hadn't met the man who refused to let it die. The miracle began that night, under a single light bulb in the fog. In every war, history remembers the pilots. Their names are painted on the sides of aircraft, their faces captured in faded photographs. Leather jackets, confident smiles, the sky behind them. But below those skies lived another army. Men without wings, without fame, whose battleground was mud, frost, and metal. They were the aircraft mechanics of the United States Army Air Forces, the silent engineers of endurance. Each one fought a different kind of war. They didn't charge through flak or face enemy fire, but they faced the cold, the fatigue, and the unrelenting rhythm of missions that never stopped. When a squadron returned, the work began. When engines failed, they rebuilt them. When wings tore apart, they made them whole again. In 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was the backbone of America's air campaign, a machine of brute power and impossible complexity. It could dive faster than any fighter in the world, shrug off cannon fire, and bring pilots home in shreds of metal barely holding together. But to keep it flying required something just as rare as courage: patience, precision, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Sergeant Walter "Red" Harris belonged to that breed. A farm mechanic before the war, he had learned to make broken things work with nothing but wire, wrenches, and instinct. He wasn't educated in aerodynamics or metallurgy. He simply knew how machines felt. And in the closing months of the air war over Europe, that instinct would do what training manuals never could. It would breathe life back into a dead fighter. This is not the story of a famous pilot or a decorated officer. It's the story of one man who looked at wreckage and saw possibility, of how a single act of defiance against impossible became a symbol of what American ingenuity truly meant. Because behind every victory in the air, there was someone in the mud making it possible. And on that fog-choked night in England, as the bombers thundered home above him, Walter Harris began to turn steel, scrap, and stubbornness into something greater. A miracle of his own making. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not born in a moment of inspiration. It was born in panic. In June 1940, France had fallen. The Luftwaffe reigned supreme over Europe. American planners realized that if their nation entered the war, their current fighters, fragile, underpowered, and short-legged, would stand no chance. So they issued an order to a quiet, sharp-minded engineer named Alexander Kartveli: design an interceptor that could climb to the edge of the stratosphere and fight there. No limit on size, no limit on weight. Just one demand: survival. Kartveli looked at the specifications, sighed, and said, "It will be a dinosaur. But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." He wasn't exaggerating. The prototype, designated XP-47B, weighed over 9,000 pounds empty. More than some bombers. Its radial engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, produced more than 2,000 horsepower and required a turbo supercharger system so large it ran the length of the fuselage. The air ducts wound behind the cockpit, like veins in a giant's body. To many test pilots, it looked less like an aircraft and more like an experiment in defying physics. And yet, when it flew, it stunned them. It climbed steadily into air too thin for most engines to breathe. It roared with a sound that rolled across the horizon, and beneath its brutish shape lay an unexpected truth. It was nearly indestructible. Kartveli had built the Thunderbolt not for elegance, but for endurance. Its fuselage frame was overbuilt by design, able to absorb hits that would tear other planes apart. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, the cockpit surrounded by steel plating, the engine protected by armor thicker than a Sherman tank's. Every wire, every tube, every rivet was designed for one thing: to keep a man alive long enough to come home. But for the mechanics who had to maintain it, that same strength was both miracle and curse. The P-47's heart, the turbo supercharger, was buried deep inside the fuselage, accessible only through cramped panels. Replacing it could take 12 hours and 3 men. Hydraulic lines ran like a maze, electrical cables snaked in layers. Every part seemed to require removing another first. To an engineer, it was precision. To a mechanic on a frozen airfield, it was punishment. By 1943, airfields in England were littered with Thunderbolts in various states of disassembly. Engines off, panels stripped, fuselages propped on makeshift stands. Rain turned runways into rivers of mud. Wrenches froze to hands. The P-47 was a marvel in the air and a monster on the ground. Yet to the men who worked on it, there was something noble about its stubbornness. It didn't give up easily, and neither did they. Walter Red Harris understood that language instinctively. Before the war, he had fixed tractors on his family's Oklahoma farm. Ancient machines held together by wire, faith, and improvisation. He'd learned that steel had moods, that you could tell what was wrong by the way a piston talked when you turned it. In the Army Air Forces, those instincts made him invaluable. He wasn't the kind of mechanic who quoted manuals. He was the kind who listened to engines. To him, the P-47 was more than a machine. It was a challenge, a beast that demanded respect and rewarded patience. He loved its contradictions, how it looked clumsy but moved like thunder, how it seemed slow yet dived faster than sound could follow. He admired its brutal logic, that survival was worth more than elegance. Still, there were limits. Every squadron had hangar queens, planes so damaged or worn that they were declared beyond repair. When an engine seized, or a supercharger cracked, or the frame twisted from a belly landing, the order was always the same: strip it for parts. The war didn't wait for miracles. But Harris didn't like orders that buried hope. He saw how pilots treated their aircraft like living things, naming them, painting them, speaking to them before missions, and he believed, in his own quiet way, that machines responded to belief. When that crashed, Thunderbolt was dragged onto the muddy tarmac. Its propeller bent, engine casings shattered, and wings buckled. Most of the crew turned away. Too much damage, they said. The turbo lines were destroyed, the fuselage spine warped, the landing gear torn. To rebuild it would mean tearing it apart entirely. But as Harris stood over the broken aircraft, he didn't see a corpse. He saw a problem waiting to be solved. He knew how the P-47 skeleton fit together, how stress traveled through its aluminum bones. He had memorized its pulse, the sound of the R2800 when it was healthy, the subtle shift in vibration when it wasn't. If a machine could still whisper, it wasn't dead yet. So when the engineers wrote it off, he quietly erased the red tag that marked it as scrap. He stayed late after his shift, studying the wreck. He made sketches in grease on the hangar wall, tracing airflow ducts, pressure points, fuel lines. He took apart spare parts from wrecked planes, searching for anything he could repurpose. He was told it was pointless. But to Harris, pointlessness didn't matter. There was dignity in trying, and in the coming weeks, that defiance, one man's refusal to accept mechanical death, would become something greater. What he was about to attempt wasn't in any manual, wasn't taught in any training school. It was born out of intuition, fatigue, and something close to faith. Because when the war demanded speed, he chose patience. And when everyone else believed in orders, he believed in possibilities. The Thunderbolt had been designed to survive battle. Now it would test whether the men who served it could do the same. By the winter of 1944, the war in the air had become a cycle of exhaustion. Every dawn began with engines roaring to life and ended with the sound of silence, the silence of the planes that didn't come back. The 56th Fighter Group was flying nearly every day, escorting bombers deep into occupied Europe. Each mission tested the limits of both pilot and machine. Flak tore holes through fuselages. Cold cracked fuel lines. Hydraulic systems bled out mid-air. The men on the ground had no time for mourning, only for mending. When a flight of Thunderbolts returned at dusk, the field would come alive again. Engines sputtering, tires half flat, oil dripping from cowlings. Mechanics would swarm each aircraft like surgeons in a field hospital. And yet, for all their effort, the work never ended. There were always too few hands and too many broken wings. Harris's unit was based out of a converted Royal Air Force field in East Anglia, a patchwork of steel huts, mud, and hangars that smelled perpetually of gasoline and damp earth. He worked the night shift, when the cold settled into bones and tools froze in the hands that gripped them. Every mechanic learned to keep a rag around his wrench or risk the metal fusing to his palm. The Thunderbolt was a brute to maintain. To reach its turbo system, the entire tail section often had to be opened like a tin can. A cracked intercooler meant 2 days of work. A damaged prop governor could ground a plane for a week. And each new pilot seemed to find a new way to test the limits of what the aircraft could endure. When a P-47 came in too low on approach and slammed into the runway that February, the sound echoed through the valley. It skidded across the field, nose first, tearing up frozen earth, before coming to rest near the tree line. The ground crew rushed forward, extinguishers hissing. The pilot climbed out, shaken but alive. The plane was less fortunate. Its propeller was twisted like ribbon. The engine casing was shattered, cylinders exposed like broken teeth. The supercharger ducts hung loose, snapped like veins cut open. When the recovery crew hauled the wreck to the hangar, the officers didn't hesitate. Tag it red. Strip it for parts. The red tag meant death. It was the airfield's final sentence, unspoken but absolute. That night, while the others finished paperwork in the mess hut, Harris lingered by the wreck. The hangar lights cast long shadows over the bent frame. He ran his hand along the side, feeling the rough edges of torn aluminum. To anyone else, it was nothing but wreckage. To him, it was still a machine that had once breathed fire. A fellow mechanic, Corporal Finnegan, wandered over, cigarette glowing in the dark. "Red, you're wasting your time," he said. "That bird's done for." Harris didn't look up. "She's just tired," he said quietly. Finnegan laughed. "You can't weld tired." The laughter spread. They called it Harris's ghost ship, a running joke between shifts, that he was trying to raise the dead while everyone else was just trying to sleep. He didn't argue. He'd grown up with that kind of laughter, the kind that said impossible before seeing proof. Over the following week, the airfield sank deeper into exhaustion. Supply delays left them short on parts. 2 more planes were grounded. The commander's temper grew shorter. To keep morale up, someone painted a cartoon on the wall of the hangar, a broken P-47 with angel wings, titled Red's Miracle Bird. Harris just smiled when he saw it. "Maybe," he said. "Every bird gets a second wind." The others didn't understand his attachment to that wreck. In the air war, machines were disposable. If one fell, another rolled off the production line. But Harris had watched too many engines die under his hands to believe they were just metal. Each plane had a rhythm, a pulse that matched the crew that flew it, the mechanic that maintained it. Lose one, and you lost a part of the squadron's soul. He started spending his breaks beside the red-tagged Thunderbolt, studying it piece by piece. At first, just curiosity, then obsession. He traced airflow paths with chalk, marked fractures, and muttered theories under his breath. When the flight officer caught him, the reprimand was swift. "Sergeant, that plane is finished. You'll waste time better spent fixing the ones that can still fight." "Yes, sir," Harris replied. But the next night, he came back. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe it was just faith, not in machines, but in what men could make of them. He started small, cleaning debris, straightening bent panels with a hammer and torch. He disassembled the ruined turboduct and found that half of it could be salvaged. The parts he didn't have, he began to scavenge. An oil line from one wreck, a fuel pump from another. He worked after curfew, using the light of a single hanging bulb. The hangar was cold and silent except for the tick of cooling metal. Every hour spent there was technically disobedience. Every repair, a risk to his rank. But to Harris, the risk was worth it. The other men began to notice the lights burning late. They joked that he was talking to ghosts, that the miracle bird had him under a spell. He let them laugh. He had no intention of arguing. He wasn't chasing miracles. He was building one, and by the time his commanding officer realized what Harris had done, it would already be too late to stop him. Because in a corner of that muddy English airfield, among the condemned and forgotten, one mechanic had decided to fight his own war. Against doubt, decay, and the idea that anything was ever truly beyond repair. The nights in East Anglia were long and unforgiving. Cold seeped through the corrugated walls of the hangar, and fog coiled around the aircraft like ghosts. Each evening after his shift, Walter "Red" Harris returned to the wrecked Thunderbolt, his private battlefield against ruin. What he was attempting bordered on madness. The aircraft had been written off by 2 senior engineers. Its supercharger housing was cracked, the tail warped, and half the ductwork torn out. By regulation, it should have been dismantled, tagged, and sent for scrap within the week. But Harris had other plans. He began with the bones, straightening the twisted engine mount using a hand chain and the hangar's support beam for leverage. Each pull of the chain came with a groan from the steel and a grunt from Harris. When the angle finally realigned, he chalked a mark on the floor and nodded to himself. "Still got fight in her," he whispered. He scavenged for parts like a prospector panning for gold. From a wrecked P-47D near the perimeter fence, he salvaged a section of exhaust duct, its edges warped from heat. From another, he took a fragment of intercooler tubing and filed it down to fit. The hangar became a cathedral of improvisation, a place where faith and mechanics met in equal measure. What he couldn't replace, he remade. The Thunderbolt's hydraulic line had been severed clean through. Regulation said it had to be replaced entirely. Harris didn't have that luxury. He cut the ends square, cleaned the edges with solvent, and sleeved the brake using a section of fuel line scavenged from a damaged drop tank. To seal it, he melted down solder wire and applied it with a torch, shaping it by instinct rather than manual. By the time he stepped back, the line gleamed faintly under the lamplight. He touched it once with a finger, testing the smoothness of the seam. "Good enough for a prayer," he muttered. He didn't stop there. When rivets ran out, He hammered flat the brass casings from spent .50 caliber rounds and used them instead. When he needed a missing panel bolt, he ground down a nail until it fit. Each shortcut was a sin against procedure and an act of devotion to possibility. Word spread across the field. Men passing by the hangar at night would see the single yellow bulb glowing through the fog. Someone began calling it the resurrection light. Others joked about Red's holy thunderbolt. But behind the laughter was something quieter: curiosity. Harris wasn't supposed to be working alone. Every repair needed a sign-off, an inspection, and a supervisor. He ignored all of them. He had no interest in bureaucracy. He wanted proof. After 2 weeks, the wreck began to look like an airplane again. The mangled cowling was reshaped, dents pounded smooth, the propeller blades straightened by heat and brute strength. He repainted the nose with the words, "Reaper's Spare," half joke, half defiance. When his crew chief discovered what he'd done, the confrontation was immediate. "You're out of your mind, Red," the chief said. "You light that engine, it'll blow the roof off this hangar." "Maybe," Harris replied. "Or maybe she'll sing again." The chief threatened to report him, but didn't. He'd seen too many miracles start with bad ideas. Still, the orders from command were clear. The aircraft remained grounded. Any test run without authorization would mean court-martial. Harris said nothing, but his eyes said everything. 2 mornings later, before sunrise, a figure appeared at the hangar door. Lieutenant Jack Conway, one of the squadron's younger pilots. He had flown half a dozen combat missions, lost 2 wingmen, and had a reputation for volunteering for anything that sounded reckless. He looked at the patched-up Thunderbolt and gave a low whistle. "She's ugly," he said. "Always was," Harris replied. "But she'll fly." Conway studied him for a long moment. "You really think she'll hold together?" Harris wiped his hands on a rag. "I don't think. I know." At dawn, they rolled the aircraft out onto the frozen strip. The fog hung thick and gray, swallowing the horizon. A few ground crew gathered, drawn by rumor and disbelief. No one spoke. Harris climbed onto the wing, leaned into the cockpit, and made final checks: fuel, pressure, hydraulics, mixture. He gave Conway a nod. "Don't push her past 2.6 manifold," he said. "She's got scars," Conway smiled. "So do we." The pilot strapped in, set the throttle, and hit the starter. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a cough, a sputter, a roar. The R-2800 came alive like a wounded beast waking from sleep. Black smoke poured from the exhaust, the ground trembled, and the sound rolled across the field like thunder reborn. Men covered their ears. Others just stared. Harris stood motionless beside the wing, eyes fixed on the engine gauges. Oil pressure climbed, temperature steady. The miracle had a pulse. Conway eased the throttle forward, taxied slowly to the edge of the strip. The control tower hadn't cleared him. No one had. But war had its own rules, and sometimes disobedience was the purest kind of courage. He lined up the nose into the wind. Harris watched from the edge of the tarmac, his hands trembling. Conway released the brakes. The patched-up Thunderbolt lumbered forward, heavy, uncertain. Then the tail lifted. The wheels left the earth. The men on the ground broke into shouts, part cheer, part disbelief. The plane climbed sluggishly at first, then steadier, the engine note smoothing into rhythm. Harris followed it with his eyes until it vanished into the mist. Minutes passed like hours. Then, faintly, the sound returned. That deep, unmistakable thunder. The P-47 broke through the clouds overhead, banking low over the airfield, its patched panels flashing in the morning light. Conway circled once, wagged his wings, and brought her in. The landing was rough, one tire nearly collapsing, but the plane held. When it rolled to a stop, the field fell silent. Conway climbed out, face streaked with oil, and pulled off his helmet. "She flies," he said simply. No one spoke for a moment. Then Harris laughed, a quiet, breathless laugh that turned into a grin. The commanding officer arrived minutes later, furious at first. "What in God's name is this?" Conway answered before Harris could. "It's a miracle, sir." The officer walked around the aircraft, running his hand over the patched skin, the uneven rivets, the repaired seams. He shook his head slowly. "That's not a repair," he said. "That's resurrection." By noon, word had spread across the base. Mechanics came to see the plane that had defied regulation. They touched its fuselage for luck before missions. Someone painted a small white lightning bolt beneath the cockpit, a symbol of rebirth. The higher command eventually filed the report under unauthorized field modification. But unofficially, they kept the aircraft in service. Reaper's Spare flew 6 more combat sorties before the war ended. Every time it returned, Harris would walk out to meet it, place a hand on the nose and say quietly, "Told you she wasn't done yet." Years later, those who served with him would remember that winter not for the missions or the losses, but for the night the hangar light burned long into the fog, and the morning when a man's stubbornness turned scrap metal into flight. The miracle hadn't been mechanical. It had been human, the triumph of faith in the hands that refused to let something die before its time. And in that hangar, under that flickering bulb, one mechanic proved what the manuals never could. That genius isn't measured in equations or rank, but in the courage to believe that broken things can still fly. What Harris had done in that hangar was not magic. It was mechanics, raw, instinctive, improvised. But behind every strike of his hammer and every improvised weld was a deeper truth about how America fought its war, through the ingenuity of its people. The Thunderbolt's strength made his miracle possible. Alexander Kartvel's engineers at Republic Aviation had built it like a flying fortress around a single principle: redundancy. Every critical system was doubled, sometimes tripled. 2 fuel pumps, dual hydraulic loops, backup ignition. If one line was severed in combat, another kept the machine alive. That philosophy of survival through excess meant that even a crippled P-47 could limp home with half its systems gone. And it meant that a mechanic with enough will could find life where others saw only wreckage. Harris understood this not through design diagrams, but through experience. He had learned that the R-2800 engine would forgive mistakes that would kill lesser machines. Its air-cooled cylinders could run with half the baffles torn away. Its magnetos would spark even when oil flooded the cowling. It was an engine built not for elegance, but endurance. A machine that seemed to want to live. When Harris spliced the severed hydraulic line, he wasn't guessing. He knew that under 1,000 psi pressure, the coupling needed a smooth seal, not perfection. He used a length of aluminum from a drop tank because the alloy matched, soft enough to flare under compression, hard enough to hold. He didn't have precision tools, so he used touch. He could feel through the wrench when the metal bit. When he used .50 caliber casings as rivets, it wasn't just symbolism. The brass was malleable, resistant to corrosion, and easy to shape under heat. Hammered flat, it spread wide, locking 2 panels tighter than standard rivets ever could. Crude, yes, but effective. Every choice he made that night balanced instinct against risk. It was not the science of design, but the art of survival. This kind of field innovation was not unique to Harris. Across every front, American ground crews were doing the same, breaking rules to keep machines in the fight. In Italy, one crew replaced a shattered propeller blade with one scavenged from a downed Spitfire, trimming the others by hand until balance returned. In the Pacific, mechanics patched bullet holes in Corsair wings with flattened beer cans and waxed tape. At Bastogne, tank crews welded snowplow blades from farm tractors to Shermans for clearing roads. It was a culture of adaptation, born not from recklessness, but from confidence. Confidence in machinery, in materials, and in themselves. America's industrial miracle didn't just exist in the factories at home. It lived in the minds and hands of men like Harris, men who carried the logic of Detroit and the improvisation of small-town workshops into the mud and cold of Europe. The Army Air Forces quietly encouraged it. Officially, there were manuals and maintenance checklists. Unofficially, there was the understanding that, if it works, it's right. Commanders learned that progress often came from the bottom up, from men with oil-stained uniforms and stubborn ideas. Harris's rebuild proved the principle in full. When engineers later examined Reaper's spare, they found his repairs held perfectly. The makeshift couplings had survived flight stress, vibration, and cold. Even the improvised rivets showed no signs of shear. In fact, his work revealed a paradox that became a quiet lesson across the 9th Air Force. Machines built to survive punishment could also survive imperfection. That discovery echoed far beyond his hangar. Within months, new field maintenance bulletins began circulating through Allied airfields. Simplified repair guides written by mechanics for mechanics. Procedures once reserved for factory overhaul were adapted for field conditions. Aircraft that would once have been scrapped now flew again. Every man on the line took pride in that transformation. They had learned that technology alone didn't win wars. Ingenuity did. In retrospect, historians often describe the American war machine as a triumph of scale. More tanks, more planes, more fuel. But that's only half the truth. The other half was flexibility, the ability to make the impossible work anyway. That flexibility lived in every hangar like Harris's, where rules bent under necessity, and faith in human judgment bridged the gap between blueprint and battlefield. The P-47 embodied that idea in metal. It was a plane that could take punishment, adapt to repair, and forgive error. It reflected the people who built and maintained it. Imperfect, determined, endlessly resourceful. When the Air Force engineers later asked Harris how he knew it would fly, he shrugged. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew it shouldn't die that easy." That line became legend among his peers. It summed up the mindset of a generation that refused to let failure dictate fate. The war had turned engineers into improvisers, and improvisers into innovators. The battlefield had become the world's largest laboratory, and men like Walter Harris, its quiet scientists of survival. What Harris achieved in that lonely hangar was not just the resurrection of one fighter. It was proof of something far greater, that in a war of mass production, the smallest human spark could still shape destiny. The first mission flown by Reaper's spare came 3 days after its resurrection. It was not supposed to happen at all. The squadron was short on aircraft. A series of bombing raids into the Ruhr had left more Thunderbolts grounded than flying. When Lieutenant Conway volunteered to take the patched-up plane, the crew chief hesitated. "She's held once," he said. "That doesn't mean she'll hold twice." Conway smiled. "Then I guess we'll find out." That morning, the sky over East Anglia was cold and brittle, the kind of winter air that made engines sing sharper and bullets fly truer. Harris stood beside the strip as the fighters lined up for takeoff. He watched Reaper's spare lumber forward, her patched cowling gleaming in the gray light. As the wheels left the ground, he exhaled and whispered the same words he always did. "Fly, girl. Just fly." The mission was routine. Escort for B-17s headed toward a ball-bearing plant in Essen. Routine in theory. In practice, nothing over Germany was routine. At 25,000 feet, the contrails stretched like white scars across the sky. Radar picked up incoming bogies, Focke-Wulfs, diving from above. Within seconds, formation turned to chaos. Conway banked hard, diving into a mess of tracers. The radio crackled with clipped voices, screams, static. he caught a glimpse of a Thunderbolt disintegrating mid-roll. A flash, then nothing. He throttled forward, feeling the patched engine strain but hold. Ahead, a pair of FW-190s closed on a crippled bomber, their cannons flickering. Conway rolled inverted, dove through the formation, and opened fire. 8 50-caliber guns spoke at once. The lead Focke-Wulf vanished in a cloud of debris. The second peeled away, trailing smoke. In the chaos that followed, Conway's instruments flickered. A round had punched through the lower cowling, severing an oil line. Pressure dropped. Under normal conditions, that would have been the end. Forced landing, bailout, or worse. But Harris's makeshift line held. The oil leak was minimal. Temperature stabilized. The patch, the same forbidden fix that had condemned the aircraft, was saving it in combat. Conway brought Reaper's spare home, battered but flying. The squadron's debrief room erupted when he walked in, covered in soot and engine oil. Someone shouted, "You flew the Ghost again?" Conway grinned, "And she brought me back." From that day forward, the plane earned a reputation. Not as the fastest or most beautiful, but as the unkillable one. Pilots began requesting to fly her on tough missions, claiming she was lucky. Mechanics rubbed her fuselage for good fortune before dawn sorties. The joke stopped being a joke. By April 1944, Reaper's spare had flown 6 combat sorties. Each time, it returned with new scars, bullet holes patched with aluminum, rivets hammered flush by hand. Each time, Harris was there to greet it, wiping oil from the engine cowling like a priest tending an altar. But the legacy that mattered most wasn't the plane itself. It was the method, the idea that if something could be made to work, it was worth trying. Word spread through neighboring squadrons about the mechanic who had brought a dead Thunderbolt back to life. Letters circulated between maintenance officers requesting Harris's notes. There were no formal blueprints, just sketches on scrap paper, measurements scribbled on the back of ration forms. Still, they spread like gospel. Soon, other crews began experimenting with field repairs of their own. One team adapted his soldered coupling method for P-51 fuel lines. Another copied his brass rivet improvisation for patching flak holes. An air depot near Norwich even drafted a technical supplement titled Harris Method, Field Substitutions, Unverified. Officially unapproved, unofficially indispensable. The results were measurable. In the months that followed, aircraft recovery rates across several 9th Air Force groups rose by 18%. Planes once scrapped were flying again. Commanders noticed. In May 1944, an engineering officer visited Harris's airfield under the pretext of evaluating unorthodox field practices. He found the mechanic in grease-stained overalls, asleep under the wing of his Miracle. When Harris woke, the officer asked how he'd known where to cut corners and where not to. Harris thought for a long moment before answering. "Sir," he said, "machines tell you what they need if you listen long enough." That single line ended up quoted in a field report that circulated across the European theater. It became shorthand for a philosophy that bridged soldier and scientist, discipline and intuition. And soon, Harris's approach, born in one dim hangar, began reshaping the unofficial doctrine of American air maintenance. By D-Day, field improvisation wasn't just tolerated. It was expected. Mechanics were instructed to restore function by any means necessary. Factories even began packaging modular repair kits based on frontline feedback. The Army Air Forces called them expedient engineering sets, but the men called them Harris kits. As the war dragged into its final year, Reaper's spare remained in rotation. By then, her original frame had been replaced piece by piece. Wings swapped, tail reinforced, panels reskinned, a ship rebuilt so often that no one knew how much of the original remained. When the squadron transitioned to ground attack operations over France, Reaper's Spare followed. She flew low and fast, her guns chewing through German convoys, her patched wings shimmering in the sun. Once, after taking a near-direct hit from flak, Conway limped her home on one-cylinder bank and no hydraulics. The landing gear refused to deploy until gravity, patience, and Harris's ingenuity worked one last miracle. The plane skidded to a stop at the end of the runway, intact once more. When the crew examined the damage, they found that Harris's brass casing rivets had held, while factory ones nearby had sheared off. Someone pinned one of the spent casings to the squadron board, marking it with the words, "Proof." By war's end, Reaper's Spare was no longer just an aircraft. It was a story, told in tents, pubs, and letters home. A story about one man's defiance of the word impossible. Decades later, in a museum archive in Dayton, a curator cataloging old maintenance logs found a brief note written in fading ink. Unauthorized field repair, aircraft restored, flew 6 successful missions. Recommend commendation withheld to avoid precedent. That single bureaucratic line, half praise, half warning, became the only official record of the miracle. But among those who lived it, the memory endured. They remembered the sound of the R-2800 coughing back to life. They remembered the glow of that lone hangar light in the fog. And they remembered the man who refused to let a machine die quietly. In the end, Reaper's Spare was dismantled, her parts scattered across depots and training units. But the spirit of that aircraft, the proof that courage and craftsmanship could outwit destruction, lived on in every mechanic who bent the rules to keep the sky alive. Walter Harris's act of defiance, the quiet rebuilding of Reaper's Spare, seemed small against the scale of the war. But his miracle was not an exception. It was a reflection of something far larger, the hidden machinery that powered the American war effort, a civilization learning to think like him. By 1944, the United States had become the greatest industrial organism the world had ever seen. In a single year, its factories produced more aircraft than Germany had built in the entire war. From the foundries of Pittsburgh to the shipyards of San Pedro, every rivet, every barrel, every engine carried the fingerprints of ordinary men and women who worked with Harris's same stubborn faith that things could be built, fixed, and flown again. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, was a city unto itself. 12,000 workers operated 24 hours a day beneath the hum of fluorescent light and the rhythm of pneumatic hammers. Every 63 minutes, another P-47 Thunderbolt rolled off the line, a symphony of coordination so vast that even its architects struggled to comprehend it. But the miracle of scale didn't end at the factory gates. It extended across oceans, into the mud, the fog, and the frost where men like Harris lived. Every factory miracle required a human one to keep it alive. Engines failed, wings cracked, supply lines faltered. The system worked because men at the edge of war refused to let it break. The U.S. Army Air Forces understood this, even if they rarely said it aloud. Their success depended not on perfection, but on resilience. The Thunderbolt was engineered for it. The American system was organized around it. In England, a single depot could overhaul 300 aircraft a month. Engines stripped, wings refitted, sent back to the front in days. But when even depots were too far away, field ingenuity took their place. Crews rebuilt machines with farm tools, patched fuel tanks with soap, rewired cockpits using telephone cable. Each improvisation became a thread in the vast tapestry of victory. Statistically, the results were staggering. By late 1944, American fighters flew over 500,000 sorties across Europe. Maintenance recovery rates exceeded 90%. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was losing aircraft faster than it could replace them, not just from combat, but from the inability to repair. Germany's precision machines were masterpieces on paper. but nightmares in the field. Engines that required micrometer tolerances failed under dust. Tanks that demanded factory calibration sat idle for lack of spare parts. America's strength was the opposite, a deliberate ruggedness. The P-47 could be repaired in a barn. Its engine could be serviced with wrenches instead of blueprints. Its systems were modular, redundant, forgiving, designed for the hands of men who worked by instinct. Harris's story captured that philosophy perfectly. He hadn't followed design doctrine. He had trusted the underlying logic of American engineering, the idea that machines should bend, not break. Every decision he made echoed that principle, that power and simplicity could coexist. That durability was a moral choice as much as a mechanical one. Historians later described the American war effort as the victory of logistics. But to the men who lived it, it felt more personal, a war of grease, grit, and repetition. Harris's hangar was as vital as any battlefield, his hammer strikes as decisive as any bomb drop. In the Pacific, aircraft mechanics slept beneath the wings they serviced. In North Africa, tank crews carried welding torches into battle. In Italy, supply clerks learned to rebuild carburetors when shipments ran late. Across every front, the war was sustained by the small, invisible miracles of human problem-solving. When General Henry Hap Arnold addressed a group of mechanics at the end of 1944, his words summed up the spirit of men like Harris. "You are the army behind the sky. You fight not with guns, but with tools. And you fight every day." The official records never mention Reaper's Spare by name. But in every restored aircraft that took off from an English field, her story lived on. Every patched seam, every improvised repair carried an echo of that night, when a mechanic refused to give up. The war was won by pilots, yes, but also by those who kept them flying. Men who believed that if something could be rebuilt, it should be. Who looked at twisted metal and saw potential, not waste. In the end, Harris's miracle wasn't extraordinary. It was the embodiment of the ordinary, the industrial faith of a nation that believed in fixing what was broken. A faith that turned individual acts of defiance into collective victory. And somewhere, among the mountains of statistics and the millions of parts, the story of one mechanic and his resurrected Thunderbolt still stands as the simplest proof of all. That America didn't just build machines to fight. It built machines and men that refused to quit. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the great machinery of war slowed to a halt. Engines that had roared without pause for years fell quiet. Hangars emptied. The smell of fuel and metal faded into memory. For Walter Red Harris, the war ended the way it had begun, with his hands on a machine. He was one of the last men in his unit to leave the airfield in East Anglia, walking the tarmac one final time before the base was abandoned to weeds and silence. He left behind his tools, his bench, and the fragments of a plane that had once defied the impossible. There was no medal, no commendation, just a signed discharge paper and a train ticket home. In Oklahoma, he returned to the rhythm of civilian life. He opened a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. The sign above the door read simply, "Harris and Sons, Engines Reborn." Locals brought him everything from farm tractors to lawn mowers, and he treated each one as if it were a fighter plane. Those who knew him said he worked with the same quiet reverence he'd shown in that hangar. Sleeves rolled up, cigarette hanging from his lip, a faint smile whenever an engine sputtered back to life. When asked once if he missed the war, he shook his head. "No," he said softly, "just the sound of things starting again." He never spoke publicly about Reaper's Spare. To him, it was just a job that needed doing. But to the men who served with him, his story became legend. Letters exchanged between veterans kept his name alive. The mechanic who refused to quit. The one who taught others that miracles didn't come from heaven, but from human hands. In 1963, A journalist researching wartime innovation tracked him down for an interview. When she asked what had driven him to rebuild a doomed fighter, he gave a simple answer: because someone had to. That phrase, like the man himself, was humble and unadorned, but it captured something essential about the generation that won the war. A belief that duty wasn't about orders or glory, but about persistence. Years later, when Harris passed away quietly in his sleep, a former pilot from his old squadron attended the funeral. He placed a small brass .50 caliber casing, polished and engraved with the words "Reaper's Spare" atop the casket. Then he saluted and said, "She flew because he believed." In museums and documentaries, the Thunderbolt is remembered for its firepower, its armor, its dominance of the skies. But the story of Walter Harris reminds us that the real miracle of the P-47 wasn't its speed or strength. It was the people who kept it alive. The mechanics, machinists, and dreamers who saw life in broken things. The war made heroes of many men. But history often forgets the ones who worked in silence, whose victories were measured not in kills, but in engines that started when they shouldn't have. Harris's miracle did not change the course of the war, but it revealed the quiet truth beneath all great struggles. That endurance, not brilliance, is what saves us. That faith in the possible, even in the face of ruin, is the purest form of courage. And somewhere in the archives of time, among the wreckage and the rust, that patched-up P-47 still flies, a symbol of everything that refused to stay broken. The war ended 8 decades ago, yet some sounds never fade. The hum of a radial engine, the clatter of tools on concrete, the quiet intake of breath when a machine thought dead sputters back to life. Somewhere, in the endless hum of history, that sound still echoes. The echo of one man's defiance against the logic of failure. Walter Harris didn't change the outcome of the war, but he changed something rarer: the meaning of persistence. He showed that war was not only won in the air, but also in the hangars and workshops where men fought battles against rust, fatigue, and despair. Every rivet he hammered, every line he spliced became an act of faith. Faith that even in the darkest hour, what's broken can still be made whole. The story of Reaper's Spare is not about a machine. It's about the quiet victory of the human spirit, the part of us that refuses to give up, refuses to walk away, refuses to believe that something is beyond repair. Long after the bombers stopped flying and the factories went silent, that spirit endured in every workshop, every garage, every pair of hands that still believes in the miracle of making something work again. Perhaps that's the truest legacy of the mechanic who turned a crashed P-47 into a miracle. He reminded us that even in war, a world built on destruction, there are those who build. And if you listen closely, in the distance between thunder and silence, you can still hear it, the sound of things starting again.